The book really began about 5 years ago in the run-up to the World Shakespeare Festival. When the World Shakespeare Festival happened, it kind of sent me out on this journey to try and discover all of these different sides to Shakespeare. That was the thing about the festival particularly. You just saw all of these different versions and all of these different languages, all of these different kinds of ways of acting, all of these different ways of understanding and interpreting Shakespeare. And I thought, I don't know this stuff. I haven't come across it before. And I really wanted to go and explore, and so that's what I did. So I essentially travelled to 5 different countries over a 2-year period. So I travelled to Germany, and I travelled to the United States, to India, to South Africa, and finally to China. And I guess what I was just really interested in is how Shakespeare is different in each of those places, how the kinds of Shakespeare that we have in this country, the English language, the tradition here is so different to what happens elsewhere in the world. And I've found all these fascinating things. The fact that there are more performances of Shakespeare done in Germany every year than there are in the UK. There are almost certainly more versions of Shakespeare on film in India than anywhere else in the world. The world's biggest Shakespeare archive isn't in Stratford-upon-Avon or London, it's in Washington DC on Capitol Hill, right next to the Supreme Court. All of these different things. So in a way, I guess what I discovered was that Shakespeare is alive in all of these places and different in each of them as well. There are almost too many surprises to mention. The time that I turned up in Beijing only to find that Shakespeare was on the cover of Life Week magazine, which is like the Chinese equivalent of Time magazine, because there was a huge anniversary happening that year and Shakespeare was this sort of huge celebrity and everyone wanted to talk to me about Shakespeare. Or the time that I started digging into the history of gold rush performances in California in the 1840s and 1850s and found that Shakespeare was the most popular playwright in the Wild West. I had no idea about that before I went out there. But probably the weirdest experience was going to a performance of Shakespeare in Munich. I was there for the conference of the Deutsche Shakespeare Gesellschaft, the German Shakespeare Society, which is the world's oldest scholarly Shakespeare society. They were having their conference there, and connected to this there were various performances. One of the performances was in a theatre in the centre of town. It was King Lear, and I thought, great, King Lear, that'll be really interesting because there's a fascinating history of that play in that country. And I got into the auditorium and there was something not quite right. I couldn't quite work out what it was. The audience was there, beautiful place. And when I realised what wasn't really right was the smell. There was something very odd. It just smelled like I was in a farmyard or something. I was thinking, this is some really un-German problem with the drains? Like, what's going on here? Basically, it transpired that as well as the human cast in King Lear, there was a cast of live pigs. 15 live pigs who were kept in a kind of off-stage pen, stage left, and were just sort of let to roam across the stage during the performance. And the whole thing was kind of set in a farmyard. I think that was the point. Though being German theatre, it wasn't entirely clear what the point was. So watching one moment, Lear is doing his huge speech on the heath and is losing his mind and, appealing to the gods and all the rest of it. And there was this huge pig just kind of trundled halfway across the stage and stood there looking at the audience. Yeah, I wasn't expecting that one. I think one of the fascinating things about Shakespeare is that because the plays are themselves so endlessly reinterpretable, they can be done in any number of different ways, in any number of different settings, in any number of different languages, they've ended up everywhere, or bits of them have ended up everywhere. I think if you think of, I don't know, who else would be a globally famous writer, Charles Dickens, for instance, their novels, they exist in their own world, they are about that very particular universe that Dickens imagines in Victorian London, and they can't really, they might have resonances elsewhere, but they are so clearly in that universe. Shakespeare, they can be about anywhere. If you're in Soviet Russia, King Lear can be a play about autocracy and lack of political freedom. If you're in California in the 19th century, Hamlet can be a kind of swashbuckling play about sword fighting, a kind of heroic man who wants to try and get back and get revenge for his father's death. If you're in South Africa, Othello, obviously during the apartheid era, has an incredibly powerful resonance that will be very, very different to the kinds of productions of Othello that we would see in this country. So in a way, I think it's the fact that Shakespeare is so flexible and so adaptable that enables him to exist in all of these different places. The thing about Shakespeare is that you can't quite get rid of him. I was talking to a globalization theorist when I was researching my book, and we were talking about different models for why Shakespeare has lasted this long. How is it that he's ended up in so many different countries, all of these different languages, all the rest of it? And he talked to me about this thing called a rhizomatic theory of global culture. A rhizome is basically a form of plant. It's like Japanese knotweed, basically. And the thing about Japanese knotweed is that you can't get rid of it because there is no root system, or rather the root system is the plant. It sort of spreads out everywhere, that becomes the plant, and as a consequence you can never quite get rid of it. And I couldn't work out why he was telling me about all this stuff to do with gardening. And he's like, oh, that's a bit like Shakespeare, isn't it? Shakespeare has all these roots in all of these different places. I suppose the logic is that that Shakespeare is the Japanese knotweed of culture somehow. As a consequence, maybe we just can't eradicate him. I'm kind of pretty cool with that idea. I hope he's still around in 400 years.